On December 8 local time, the chaos in Syria rapidly escalated. As of the time of writing, Syrian opposition armed forces have entered the presidential palace of Syria, and President Bashar al-Assad is nowhere to be found, which means that the situation in Syria has undergone fundamental changes. In fact, since November 27, when the Syrian opposition armed forces broke through from their stronghold in Idlib province and captured Aleppo, until now, when the Assad regime that has ruled Syria for 54 years has completely collapsed, it has only taken 12 days. The speed and intensity of the evolution of the Syrian situation have shocked the world. The Syrian government forces that guarded the Assad regime collapsed like a landslide. On the surface, it seems to be a highly unpredictable black swan event. However, if it is analyzed in connection with the increasingly intense global geopolitical game in recent years, it is not difficult to find that the current Syrian crisis is the result of a long-term chemical reaction of Syria's internal and external dilemmas. The threats and chaos have long been lurking and only burst out suddenly during the so-called fragile moment in history. Looking back at history, Russia formally militarily intervened in Syria in 2015 to help the Syrian government forces fight against Islamic State and anti-government armed forces, which actually made Syria passively enter an extremely complex geopolitical game among major powers. Since then, the military confrontation and the struggle for spheres of influence between the Assad government and anti-government organizations have ceased to be simply an internal contradiction within Syria, but have become a proxy tool for strategic games among major camps in the region. In recent years, the spillover effects of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Israel-Palestine conflict have spread far faster than expected. The intense confrontation between the two major camps led by the US and Israel and Russia and Iran respectively has made the situation in the Middle East extremely precarious. Syria, due to its important geopolitical location, has become the most dangerous one among these precarious eggs that is most likely to suffer a catastrophic collapse. This kind of risk is reflected in the Syrian situation in recent years. Firstly, it is the uncertainty presented by the complex web of various factions. Specifically, the forces in Syria can be divided into four major categories. First, the Syrian Arab Army SA is supported by Russia, Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Second, the Hayat al-Shem HTS, which is the core force of the al-Shem coalition and has the support of the United States, Israel and Turkey, and its vassal Turkestan Islamic Party TIP. Third, the Syrian National Army SNA, a pro-Turkish armed force actually controlled and commanded by Turkey. Fourth, the Kurdish forces supported by the United States, but with limited help to the government forces, such as the Syrian Democratic Forces SDF and the People's Protection Units YPG. In addition, there are various tribal armed forces and small warlords entrenched in different provinces of Syria. They wait for opportunities to strive for strategic interests for themselves. For example, the anti-government armed forces that re-emerged from Daraa province in southern Syria in the later stage of the war, and the Druze armed forces that defected in Esvita province. The relationships between friends and foes of the above various factions are highly complex, and the strategic interests of each faction are extremely fragmented. Even within the area actually controlled by one faction, there may be hidden viable forces of the enemy faction, which undoubtedly greatly increases the security risks faced by the Assad government. Secondly, the game among major powers in Syria has in fact never really stopped. Although a certain strategic balance has been maintained for a relatively long period of time, if one force shows obvious weakness, the various forces in Syria will experience a situation of ebb and flow. In recent years, Russia has been bogged down in the quagmire of the war in Ukraine. Reasons such as geopolitical setbacks, economic decline, Military consumption and internal political unrest have made it unable to do what it wants in supporting Syria. Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon have been at a disadvantage in the back end, fourth game with Israel, and have also shown signs of fatigue in supporting Syria. The surrounding Arab countries have always maintained an attitude of staying out of it. However, in sharp contrast, the United States and Israel have a very strong will to dismantle the Shiite crescent that has long threatened their strategic interests. Syria, as an important link connecting Iran, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and even Hamas. Its strategic value in being conquered for the purpose of weakening Iranian forces and relieving the pressure of the war on the Western Front is self-evident. Another power, Turkey, although it does not seek to overthrow the Assad regime, when the supporters of Assad are on the wane, it is precisely the best time window for it to expand its rights and interests in northern Syria, and then strive for greater strategic initiative against the Kurdish forces, under the combined effect of the above multiple factors. Although the occurrence of the current Syrian crisis seems extremely sudden, it actually shows a certain inevitability. Thirdly, if the above external factors have played a catalytic role, then the fundamental displacement and dissipation of the ruling authority of the Assad government have directly pushed it into the final desperate situation. The war that has lasted for more than 10 years has caused a devastating blow to the Syrian economy, with direct losses amounting to hundreds of billions of dollars. According to calculations by relevant institutions, the initial funds required for Syria to complete economic reconstruction are 4 times the pre-war gross domestic product. However, due to the fact that the precious oil resources are controlled by the Kurdish forces in the north, and the industrial and agricultural production capacity in the government-controlled areas is severely insufficient, the means by which the Assad government can obtain income are extremely limited. This has led to a significant decline in Syria's GDP and fiscal budget and has directly affected military expenditure. In addition, under the situation of being beset with difficulties both at home and abroad, the wartime economic assistance to Syria from the Alawite oligarchic group as well as Russia and Iran has also shrunk significantly, which has further aggravated the economic difficulties of the Syrian government forces. Coupled with the serious corruption and polarization phenomena in Syria, the military pay that does not match the efforts has severely weakened the fighting will of the Syrian government forces, especially the grassroots officers and soldiers. In fact, it is not an isolated case in recent years that senior officers such as generals and colonels in the Syrian army have defected due to dissatisfaction with the Assad regime. Theoretically speaking, although the strength of the Syrian government forces is far from what it used to be, the opposition armed forces still have a generational disadvantage compared with them. In fact, in the middle of the current offensive launched by the anti-government armed forces, that is, during the Hama offensive and defensive battle around December 2nd, the Syrian government forces still had a certain advantage. At that time, the Syrian government forces dispatched General Suhail al-Hassan, the commander of the elite 25th Special Mission Forces Division, to take command in Hama and directed the main forces of the Syrian army to conduct multiple rounds of seesaw battles with the opposition armed forces along the line from Sura to Samira. At the same time, the Russian Aerospace Forces Composite Brigade in Syria carried out air-ground fire interdiction against the opposition armed forces. However, even with such an advantage, whenever they suffered certain combat losses, the Syrian government forces would quickly lose their fighting spirit and then flee in a panic to the deep areas, even discarding heavy special warfare weapons such as T-90 tanks, Russian-made helicopters and anti-aircraft missiles along the way, indirectly providing firepower assistance to the opposition, with General Suhail being wounded and even some media reporting that he had been killed in battle. The fighting will of the Syrian government forces further accelerated its collapse on multiple fronts. There were situations where the Syrian army collapsed at the first encounter, surrendered without a fight, or defected on the battlefield. Therefore, it is not difficult to understand how the Hayat al-Hassan was able to march southward, all the way along the M5 highway with almost no shelter works and directly reach Homs province. It is also not difficult to understand how the opposition armed forces from Daraa province in the south, whose combat capabilities are far inferior to those of the government forces, could appear in the southern suburbs of Damascus overnight if the Syrian government forces had actively defended. It would not have been impossible to block the opposition armed forces outside the Hama defense line. Now that the overall situation has been settled, it shows that the Assad regime's control over the Syrian situation has long been ineffective and the Syrian army has long been demoralized from the perspective of specific tactical comparisons. The anti-government armed forces led by the Hayat al-Hassan demonstrated a tactical proficiency far beyond their appearance in this offensive. They even weaponized the social media, forming a new combat method that combines firepower warfare and cognitive warfare. That is, they concentrated firepower to open a breakthrough in urban strongholds, and then broke up into small groups and penetrated deep behind enemy lines. They let soldiers armed with rifles and carrying the marks of the anti-government organization take pictures and post them at iconic locations such as the Hafez al-Assad Monument, Bashar's portrait, and urban billboards, creating the illusion that the place had been captured and that the enemy was everywhere in the deep areas, thereby disrupting the opponent's morale and seizing the strategic initiative. In comparison, under the combined effect of a series of factors mentioned above, the Syrian government forces actually responded to the opponent's new combat method, ultimately helping them to be invincible and achieve twice the result with half the effort. At this point, one cannot help but lament the tragic fate of the Syrian people. It is certain that the hasty collapse of the Assad regime does not mean the end. With the established fact that the Shiite crescent has been severed, the geopolitical pattern of the Middle East is about to undergo a profound rewrite. At the same time, Syria will also experience a difficult and complex reshuffling process. What the Syrian people and even the people of surrounding countries will have to face will definitely not be a gentle and peaceful night.